We are awash in a sea of change. And whatever optimism we may have had about an identifiable, stable structure of a new world order following the end of the Cold War has largely gone by the way. Indeed, a central insight of the pragmatic philosophers William James and Don Dewey and the progressive reformers that followed in their wake was that the only historical constant really is change. And rather than float with fate, it is incumbent upon thinking human beings to decide how to navigate in that sea of possibilities. That navigation is to be informed by systematic investigation and empirical warrant. Knowledge not for its own sake, but for its ability to sort through and sometimes even solve our most challenging real-world problems. In such, we are engaged these 2 days of the forum. The three main questions we have been and are addressing are, what are the trends of change in the international system? How do we value them, positively or negatively? And what shall we do? This panel has been asked to consider the first question, what are the problems we confront and how shall we understand their structures? And the third question, given this understanding, how shall we navigate? There's another contribution of the progressive movement to the peculiar strength and traditions of the American polity, and that's represented in the distinguished members of our panel this afternoon. Namely, the vigorous development of public and private universities, civil society, and a cadre of professional public servants, the interaction among these three groups, and the movement of individuals back and forth among the three. And as we have seen, real-world problems don't present themselves in distinctive disciplinary categories. There are no such things as political science problems. There are real-world problems on which different disciplines come to bear. And in this panel, we have economics, history, and political science represented, and probably some I don't know about. On to our panelists. Mr. Max Boot, eminent military historian, foreign policy analyst, and commentator, has provided us with consistently broad-reaching and thought-provoking analyses through traditional books, op-ed pieces, articles in professional journals, and public speaking. His Savage Wars of Peace has been influential in setting historical context for our present environment. Professor Henry Now of George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs has published widely on international relations and foreign policy in traditional academic venues. He's also served as a senior member of the National Security Council and as a special advisor in the Department of State. And finally, Ambassador Nancy Soderberg has served on U.S. Senate staff, in the White House as Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, as alternate U.S. Representative to the United Nations, and has also served as a Senior Executive for the International Crisis Group. Presently, she is President of the U.S. Connect Fund and a Distinguished Visiting Scholar at the University of North Florida. So our panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Max, would you care to start?
Well, it's a pleasure to be back here with all of you at the War College, which does a tremendous job. And I have to say, I'm just happy to be back here in the summertime, because last time I was here was the wintertime, and I didn't realize it could get this cold south of Buffalo. So I was very impressed by that. Now, our subject on the panel today is the structure of international politics. And it's pretty obvious what the structure of international politics has been in the post-World War II era. First, you had decades of bipolarity, and then, since 1991, you've had the unipolar world. And if there is a conventional wisdom about what the future is going to be, I think it is that the world will cease to be unipolar, that the 21st century will not be an American century, that we are seeing already, in fact, the post-American world, the Chinese century. These are some of the tropes one commonly hears about from those who discuss the nature of the international system. I would like to challenge those assumptions here today. If there is one constant throughout American history, it has been declinism, the notion that our best days are behind us. This was something that even the Founding Fathers thought, that they were not as hardy and not as strong as the pioneers who had arrived before them. And it has certainly been the case that for many decades in the past, in the recent past, the conventional wisdom among political scientists and international relations theorists and various other academics has been that American power cannot possibly last. The only constant we've seen, or the only change we've seen among this constant denigrating of American power, the only change we've seen is who the successor was going to be. It wasn't too long ago in the 50s and 60s that the conventional wisdom was that we were going to be overtaken by the Soviet Union, that mighty industrial monolith. Then, in the 1980s, we were told we were going to be overtaken by Japan. In the 1990s, it was the turn of the European Union. Today, we hear that China is going to be the power that knocks us off the pedestal. Well, count me a skeptical. There is no doubt sounds like I'm not the only one who's skeptical. I'm glad I'm speaking at the Naval War College, not at Harvard University. I'd be getting boos. Well, as I say, I am skeptical, and although it sounds like I may not need to convince all of you in this room why I'm skeptical of those predictions of American doom and decline, I will nevertheless do so. Nothing as satisfying as preaching to the choir. But I will say, and I will get to this in a minute, I certainly don't take it as a given that America will be #1 for all time to come. Clearly, our day will wane at some point. I just don't think it will be any time near soon, although I think there are some real dangers that we have to worry about. But first, let me just very briefly run over some of the sources of American strength, which tend to get ignored by the conventional wisdom, which holds that our best days are behind us. Start with population. And the fact is, the United States, this is a crucial source of strength, the United States is still a growing country demographically. If you look at the UN population prospects looking forward 50 years, they predict that our population will go from about 310 million to about 400 million, a pretty substantial population growth. What's happening in other countries that have been suggested as being American competitors? Japan is going through a demographic implosion, going from the projection being that they're going to go from about 126 million population to about 100 million. Russia is going through a demographic implosion. They're going from about 139 million to about 116 million. Really massive population decline. Europe, the European Union, is going through a population implosion, going from about 732 million population to projected 691 million. The one outlier here is China, which is going to projected to see a slight rise in population from about 1.3 billion to 1.4 billion. But those figures mask the graying of the population, the consequences of their one-child policy. The fact is they face many of the same problems that Japan and Europe face, with a huge bulge of retirees coming down the road and having a smaller base of workers from which to pay for that. So their population prospects are actually fairly troubled as well. Then you look at economic growth. We've actually been more resilient in the last several years going through the recession and bouncing back out of it, even though we're still not out of it 100%. We've certainly been more resilient than Japan or the European Union. Our share, the American share of global GDP has stayed roughly constant, in fact, for the last 15 or so years. In fact, for a longer period than that, about 25% of global GDP generated by the United States. Now, that's down from our highs immediately after World War II, when the rest of the world was devastated, but it's actually pretty remarkably constant that we've been at about a quarter of global GDP, while others, including some notable competitors, have been on the decline. With the European Union, their share of global GDP falling from about 25% to about 21% in the last 15 years. Japan falling off the cliff from about 18% to about 9%. What about the rising powers, the so-called BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, which are mooted as being the new potential superpowers in the world? They've certainly gone up, no question about it, but they've gone up from about 7% of global GDP to about 15%. So they're a long way from overtaking us. And I think there are good reasons to doubt whether they will, in fact, be able to overtake us. And when you think about why I think our prospects are good, let me mention a number of factors, including the amazing productivity and the amazing creativity of the American workforce, our ability to come out with new ideas that drive not just our economy, but in fact the global economy. Look at which country has produced the most Nobel laureates in the last 10 years. We've produced 67 of them. The European Union, and I assume, admittedly, that counts some who are less than genius level, getting it for political achievements more than scientific achievements. But nevertheless, I think the majority of those would certainly be counted as scientific and technological innovators. So 67 of those compared to 39 in Europe, so almost twice as many as Europe. And what about Japan, China, and Russia? They're really negligible. Japan has produced 8 Nobel laureates, Russia 4, China 2. 2 Nobel laureates from China in the last 10 years. I mean, that is a pretty significant statistic in terms of who is generating the new ideas that will drive the economy and the world forward. There's some other factors one can point to, especially those which we sort of take for granted, which is the incredible stability of American political institutions. In fact, I think this might be the biggest advantage we have over other potential rivals, in particular Russia and China. I mean, we sort of take it for granted that there is very little questioning the legitimacy of our democratic institutions. Yes, there are a few, crazy militia people running around Idaho, but it's really a negligible number. For 99.9% of the American people, they accept that the government, even when it does things they don't like, has a basic democratic legitimacy about it. It would be inconceivable for us to think about a coup occurring in the United States. I mean, that belongs in the realm of 7 Days in May and works of fiction. It's not reality. Many other countries around the world don't enjoy that kind of political legitimacy and stability. And in particular, when you look at Russia and China, their governments are about as illegitimate as you can possibly get, really hanging on by their fingernails, I would say, trying to assuage popular discontent with greater economic growth. But boy, if that economic growth slows down, watch out. And that is a huge advantage that we have over others, which I think we really need to pay attention to. And it's very hard to, put your finger on it, but you can, I mean, there are statistics one can cite, for example, the much lower level of corruption in the United States as opposed to, for example, China and Russia, where again, it's off the charts. But I mean, those will have, I think, very severe repercussions for the growth prospects of those other countries. I mean, I was talking not long ago with a manager of a large New York investment fund, and he's done business in China and India, and he said, I've just made a big investment in India. We're building a big real estate development in India. And I said, well, did you think about China as being the place where you're going to put it? And he said, no way. I don't have any faith in China's future. It can be taken away from me. There's no rule of law there. Why would I make that kind of long-term commitment in China? I have much more confidence in India, which at least has democratic institutions and independent judiciary. We tend to be so enthralled by China's growth rate that we lose sight of the potential obstacles to that growth continuing uninterrupted into the future. And I think there's, in fact, good reason to think that it will not continue, that a lot of these problems, underlying problems that China has having to do with corruption, nepotism, instability, all those things sooner or later I think will catch up with China, and it will not necessarily enjoy the kind of straight up the charts growth that it's enjoyed in the last several decades, starting from what is still, remember, a very low base, and still having to deal with issues of income inequality and very uneven growth. So I think there are good reasons to be skeptical of Chinese capacity in the future. And now notice I haven't even mentioned the most striking example of American dominance, which is our defense establishment, the establishment that all of you belong to. And of course it is striking that we spend over $660 billion a year on our defense, which is roughly as much as the rest of the world combined. I mean, I recently had a chance to travel around the world, basically hopscotching around American bases from the CENTCOM AOR to the PACOM AOR with a group of Council on Foreign Relations members. And, I've been to many of those places before, and I've seen them, but just to see them in kind of a compressed period of time is really an awesome experience. To go and see American bases in Bahrain and in Iraq and Kuwait, then see them from Hawaii to South Korea to Japan, all these different countries, all these different cultures, the one constant being how much they rely upon the United States military for their own protection. And again, that's something we take for granted, the fact that the entire world is broken up into American combatant commands. It doesn't generate much attention, much publicity. It doesn't really generate much protest most of the time. And yet there is nothing comparable. There is not a Chinese commander for Africa. There are not Indian generals running around East Asia trying to deal with the geopolitical situation there. I think the world sort of takes for granted the fact that the United States military, as much as anything else, is what keeps the global political and economic system in harmony. But I think that is something that people value, even though they don't often say it. They like to kick us in the shins. But at the end of the day, I think they're pretty happy that we're there, because there's a simple dynamic which prevails, which is that, of course, everybody resents us. You know, I'm from New York. There's probably not too many people outside of New York who like the New York Yankees, especially not when you get into the Red Sox neighborhood here. I think there are good reasons not to like them. But even if they are not well-liked, I think there is a respect for what they are able to achieve. And I think there is a respect for what the United States has been able to achieve and for the service we provide, which is essentially protecting neighbors from one another. Because they may resent us, but they fear their neighbors. And you really see that dynamic very strongly in both the Middle East and East Asia. In the Middle East, of course, the neighbor they fear is Iran. And of course, all of the Persian Gulf states, or Arabian Gulf states as they would like to say, view the United States as the essential protector of their national security going forward. In East Asia, it's China. And you hear a lot about China's soft power and how they are on a charm offensive. Well, let me tell you, I don't see that much evidence of the Chinese charm offensive in East Asia, where I think they're scaring the bejesus out of all of their neighbors. And you're seeing even countries like Vietnam, which were fighting us not that long ago, trying to cozy up to us because they are desperate for that American balancer, because they don't want the Middle Kingdom to reestablish its traditional hegemony over the region. That's the last thing they would like to see, and yet they see the signs that the Chinese are doing it, and so they are all flocking into our corner, hoping that we will protect them from this rising dragon. And I think that is a very powerful dynamic because we are not a great power in the way the Soviet Union was, or Nazi Germany was, or even the Roman Empire was, because we are not imposing our rule at gunpoint. We are what has sometimes been called an empire of consent. We are a country which is able to maintain its great power status in large part because most of the world views us as a benign actor. And it's easy to lose sight of that when people are complaining about cowboy diplomacy and unilateralism and out-of-control America. But at the end of the day, they are not ganging up to contain us. They are not making military alliances against us the way they would be doing if we were genuinely a threat to their national security in the way that the Soviet Union was, or Nazi Germany was, or other belligerent, despotic, would-be hegemons were. We are a liberal empire. We are a liberal hegemon, one that I think delivers incredibly valuable goods for the entire international system. And I hope that we will continue delivering those goods. Now, there are certainly threats that might endanger our ability to do so, but I think they are mostly internal rather than external. I think there is certainly good cause to be worried about our social welfare spending and the level of public debt that we are incurring. It has not reached catastrophic proportions yet. We are no Greece, Spain, or Portugal. Public debt as a percentage of GDP today is still only about 53%, compared to 73% in the EU and, oh my gosh, 192% of GDP in Japan. I mean, that is catastrophic. We are not there yet, but I am concerned about the trends. I am concerned when I see that defense spending is now less than 20% of our entire federal budget. You know, we forget that from 1789 to 1976, defense was the majority of federal spending, over 50%. Then you had that crossover point in 1976 when social welfare payments became a larger portion of the budget than defense. And since then, that trend has been going like this, with Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid taking about 35% of the budget today, and defense about 17%. That, to me, is a trend of concern, especially when I see a vast new health care entitlement being passed. Now, I know CBO claims that this will somehow actually reduce federal spending on health care in the future. And if you believe that, I think you believe that the oil spill will be stopped tomorrow. To my mind, there's a real danger where we're headed with the current Obama administration and the current Democratic Congress. I think there's a danger that we will pile up so many social welfare commitments that we will in fact suffer the fate of Europe, where they spend over 50% of GDP in the public sector, and yet can only afford to spend about 2% on defense, because social transfer payments have crowded out defense spending. If that were to happen, I think it would be a tragedy, not only for the United States, but for the world. I don't think we can afford to spend less on defense than we're spending, even though the core defense budget has actually doubled in real terms since 2001. Our commitments have also expanded tremendously, and they will continue to be large. I mean, it's striking to me to visit with both the 5th Fleet in Bahrain and the 7th Fleet in Japan, and just to see the op-tempo that they have. And they're not actually at war. They're not at war in the way that Army or Marine troops are in Afghanistan or Iraq, but it feels like they're at war. They're out at sea all the time. They don't have enough ships to cover all the commitments they have. I mean, we take for granted what the U.S. Navy does, not only for us, but for the world, keeping the sea lines of communication safe, but it becomes harder and harder to do that with 280 ships, no matter how capable each individual ship is. It becomes harder to do that when your aerial refuelers are more than 40 years old. It becomes harder to do that, by the way, when the Army is about 550,000 active duty strength, down from its where it was at the end of the Cold War at about 710,000. I mean, those kinds of reductions in force size place tremendous burdens on the force, and we cannot afford to continue those trends in the future. So I'm alarmed and I'm concerned when I see Secretary Gates talking about the need for reductions in the defense budget, when I see on the domestic side of the ledger nothing but vast increases in spending, $100 billion for this industry, $100 billion for that industry. What about defense? I don't think we should accept that we can somehow maintain our present status as the world's policeman, which is a status that I think we have to maintain, for not only for our good, but for the good of the world. It would be very hard to maintain that if defense budgets truly fall in the years ahead. And I think it is really incumbent upon the services not to simply go with the flow, and to make clear that if the politicians want us to have all these commitments, they better put up the bucks to pay for them. And I don't see a lot of people saying pull back from the commitments. I don't see a lot of people saying pull out of South Korea, pull out of Japan, pull out of the Middle East. I don't hear a lot of that. I hear, in fact, people wanting more commitments. Deal with this humanitarian disaster. Deal with that earthquake. Deal with all these problems around the world. And I think we ought to deal with it. But the politicians have to come up with the money to pay for it. And we can afford it. Even now, we are still, even in the midst of 2 wars, we are still spending less than 5% of GDP on defense. That is a historically low figure. During the Cold War, we easily spent 7 to 8% of GDP. In peacetime, when we didn't even have a war going on, we can certainly afford to keep spending 4 to 5% or even more of defense. And I think we need to, in order to expand the size of the Army and the Navy and take some of the strain off the current force, which has a lot of responsibilities around the world. As I say, I think we can afford to do it, and I think we need to be able to afford to do it. I don't think there is any inherent check upon American power other than the limitations we place on ourselves. But those limitations are real, and I get alarmed when I see my former colleague Peter Beinart, for example, with an essay out in the last few days saying it's a good thing that America is not going to be the hegemon it has been, applauding that. To my mind, that's a very dangerous sentiment, but one which unfortunately is very widespread among the American elite. If the world doesn't have a benign hegemon, I think the world will look a lot like as it did in the 1920s and 1930s. Whereas if the world does have a benign hegemon, and if we play that role, I think there are good prospects to continue the expansions of freedom, of democracy, of economic prosperity that we've seen in recent decades under American leadership. I think we need to continue exercising that leadership in the future, and I think there's no reason why we can't, except, as I say, the limitations and the shackles that we place on ourselves.
Well, I too am delighted to be here at the War College, especially on this gorgeous day. Sorry, we're keeping you in this auditorium rather than out on the water. But I'm also delighted that I'm following Max Boot, because I couldn't agree with him more. I wrote a book, in fact, 20 years ago called The Myth of America's Decline. I obviously didn't have much impact on the debate. because ever since, as Max points out, we've been debating a wave of declinist arguments almost every 5 years or so. And I'm a great optimist about America and about its resilience and about its society. And just back from a trip to China, and I left thinking to myself, I couldn't get on the Naval War College website from my hotel room in Beijing. And I thought to myself, how does this society think that it's going to compete with ours when the rubber hits the road? I mean, that kind of fear of your own people and fear of information and fear of dissent can't win, I think, over the long run. So I'm a big optimist. Now, I'm going to make an argument about the nature of the international order that'll tie maybe some things together that Max said with what you were talking about this morning. And I want to suggest that I don't think anything really fundamental has changed in terms of how the international order works. I'm going to be a skeptic that somehow or other technology changes things radically. If I were to tell you that we just had a major communications, a major resource, a major transportation revolution, I could be talking about 1910, or I could be talking about 2010. We've had massive technological changes in the past, but our conception and thinking about world order, I don't think has changed all that much. And what I want to do is I will oversimplify to some extent, but I want to try to lay out two fundamental ways of thinking about the international order. One is a jigsaw puzzle view of the world, where our primary task, we view our primary task as one of solving problems, sitting around the table together, putting a jigsaw together, figuring out how the pieces fit, how to manage the problems that we share in common. The second point of view is a chessboard view or a chess game view of the world, in which players compete, and in which players try to counter one another, and indeed in which players try to checkmate one another, and in which the objective is to win, not just to solve problems. Now, both of these views, I think, have substantiation in history. They both have some empirical evidence to them. They have both applied at different points in time. I'm not going to try to suggest that one is right and one is wrong. I think the trick for leadership is getting the proportions and the timing right between these two conceptions of international order, knowing when to apply one or the other. The common argument is made that Bush, George W. Bush, saw the world too much in terms of a chess match and too little in terms of a jigsaw puzzle. I want to suggest that Barack Obama may be making exactly the reverse mistake. He may be seeing the world too much in terms of a jigsaw puzzle and too little as a chess match. Now, few presidents have actually gotten this relationship between these two ways of thinking about the world right. Successful presidents have. I'm currently looking at 4 in my own research: Thomas Jefferson, James Polk, Harry Truman, and Ronald Reagan. And frankly, my champion so far is James Polk. Much understood and under-researched American president, but I'll suggest at the end of my talk why he comes out, I think, on the top of this list, with Ronald Reagan, by the way, very, very close behind. Now, what about this jigsaw puzzle view of the world, and how does Obama's approach reflect primarily this point of view up to this stage? 4 propositions define this jigsaw puzzle view of the world. First, problems in the world are believed to be created by material, not moral shortcomings or failures. Resource use, such as fossil fuel consumptions, threatening the planet. Weapons and the spread of the diffusion of weapons material, such as loose nukes, are encouraging violence or could encourage violence. Economic growth is inadequate to alleviate poverty, which in turn breeds terrorism. And interdependence lags, such that multilateral institutions like the UN and the International Criminal Court and other international institutions lack the capacity to manage global problems effectively. At the United Nations last September, Obama made clear that these material or physical threats constitute his view of the primary challenges facing the United States. He identified 4 pillars, as he said, of U.S. engagement in the world. 1, nonproliferation and disarmament. 2, the promotion of peace and security, stability. 3, the preservation of our planet. And 4, a global economy that advances opportunity for all people. Now, in his national security strategy released just 2 weeks ago, he repeats this litany. First, countering violent terrorism and insurgency, stability. Second, stopping the spread of nuclear weapons and securing nuclear materials. 3, combating climate change or changing climate. And 4, sustaining economic growth and helping countries feed themselves. Notice that the spread of freedom, democracy, and human rights is not one of these global pillars or challengers as perceived by Obama. Promoting values, he believes, is largely a domestic undertaking. Each country should do this on their own. We're very supportive, he says, of democracy around the world, but democracy is largely something that is in the hands of the people of that country alone, and certainly the United States itself will never impose its values on them. He has a very telling comment in the National Security Strategy, and I quote, "In keeping with the focus on the foundation of our strength and influence, we are promoting universal values abroad by living them at home, and will not to seek to impose those values." So spreading freedom will have to happen by emulation, not by engagement, even though despots in the world resist the example of freedom, often by force, as they do daily by suppressing freedom at home. Second, these material problems are interrelated, and they're based on mutual or shared, not competitive or conflicting interests. Now, because the problems are interrelated, there really are no priorities among them. Problems have to be solved together. Obama made 10 foreign trips to 21 countries in his first year in office. And if you ask what his priorities are in foreign policy, the answer is multiple. And because these problems are shared, countries not only have common interests in solving them, they also have similar visions of the final outcome or picture that emerges once the jigsaw puzzle is put together. You know how when you put a jigsaw puzzle together, you sometimes look at the cover of the puzzle box to see what that final picture looks like. The assumption is that we all have that same picture in mind as we sit around and try to put these pieces together. So, for example, all countries see a world without nuclear weapons in roughly the same way. Otherwise, that world in which some countries might not give up nuclear weapons could be very dangerous. At the UN, again, Obama made very clear that this notion of shared interest is very important to him. He said, and I quote, "It is my deeply held belief that in the year 2009, more than at any point in human history, the interests of nations and people are shared." In Prague, he warned, this was earlier in the summer last year, he warned, or in spring, I guess it was, he warned against emphasizing separate or sovereign interests. He said, and I quote, "When nations and people allow themselves to be defined by their differences, the gulf between them widens," end quote. Shared interests trump sovereign interests. Third, because all countries share interests in a jigsaw puzzle view of the world, they must be at the table to solve them. Multilateralism is the bumper sticker of the Obama administration. Repeatedly, the president references the international institutions and the currents of international cooperation that comprise the centerpiece of American foreign policy. Fourth, and in spite of the fact that despots may not agree, the use of force in a jigsaw puzzle view of the world is a last, if not a past, resort in managing world affairs. As a candidate, Obama made clear that force is justified only after a country is attacked. Based on this logic, he concluded Afghanistan was a necessary war, Iraq was a war of choice. And consistent with that logic, Obama is withdrawing troops from Iraq, even though the threat from Iran in the region grows, and he is surging forces in Afghanistan, even though he sets deadlines for their withdrawal at the same time, and thus leaves allies such as Pakistan wondering if we really have the staying power to prevail in that conflict. Now, as I suggested, some problems meet the definition of world order that Obama prefers. No one would argue that climate change requires the cooperation of all countries. But countries, one might question the assumption that countries agree on the timetables or the final outcomes of such cooperation. They may be working with different puzzles, not with the same one, and so they have different pictures of what the puzzle is going to look like when you finally put it all together. And the reason is because they see the world differently. They don't share interests to that extent. Now, what are the key features of a chessboard view of the world, and how did George W. Bush's view, or how does George W. Bush's view reflect this approach to world order? Again, 4 propositions. First, from a chessboard view of the world, global problems are not primarily material, but moral. Countries differ in their assessment of material problems, nuclear weapons, for example, because they value different cultural, religious, and political systems. In fact, countries are separate in the first place because they constitute different political and cultural systems. They define the most important problems in the world not by material circumstances, but by their political or cultural standards. George W. Bush defined the problems in the world in his second inaugural address in 2005 as promoting democracy and ending tyranny. He declared, and I quote, "It is the policy of the United States to seek and support the growth of democratic movements and institutions in every nation and culture with the ultimate goal of ending tyranny in our world," end quote. So from this chessboard view of the world, countries see more specific outcomes related to their more specific interests. China, for example, sees the world problems not in terms of solving global warming, but in terms of advancing the economic prosperity of the new Chinese nation. Second, from a chessboard view of the world, interests are not mutual and shared, but sovereign and competitive. Each nation would like to live in a material world that shares more of its sovereign standards and solves problems in ways that advance its cultural and political influence. Thus, while the United States seeks to spread political standards of human rights and democratic systems, Russia and China would prefer a world that is more sympathetic to authoritarian governments, and they oppose interventions in sovereign nations to advance humanitarian or political goals. Russia in Kosovo, certainly China in Taiwan. Third, from the chessboard view of the world, nations do not see problems as interrelated or share the same vision of the world that emerges from fitting all the pieces of the puzzle together. Take for a moment this problem of a world without nuclear weapons. That world, by the way, is one of Obama's many global priorities. The jigsaw view of the world suggests that everyone accepts and does not challenge this outcome because they have a common interest in avoiding nuclear war and can rely on international institutions to enforce nonproliferation. The chessboard view doubts these assumptions and worries that international institutions may not be up to the task and may act in ways that infringe sovereign interests. A good example may be the final resolution of the recently concluded Nonproliferation Treaty Review Conference in New York. This resolution explicitly identified Israel as a proliferator of nuclear weapons, but did not mention Iran or North Korea. To stick with his jigsaw puzzle view of the world, Obama decided not to veto that resolution. Fourth, countries that see the world as a chessboard do not seek engagement in multilateralism as the centerpiece of their foreign policy, but compete and seek leverage through other means, especially military means, in order to push for final outcomes more to their liking, more to their final picture of their puzzle cover box. They act unilaterally or through alliances. They counter and, if possible, checkmate other players, knowing that the game is decided not by how many problems are solved, but by whose influence expands in order to solve those problems. Thus, Russia intervenes forcefully in Georgia, objects strenuously to NATO missile defenses in Eastern Europe, cooperates militarily with China and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, supports only minimal sanctions against Iran, and presses an arms control agreement with the United States. Not, one could argue, to solve a common proliferation problem, but to extend Russia's influence in the space formerly dominated by the Soviet Union, and to enhance Russia's global status or seat at the table of great powers. Similarly, China develops a blue water navy, supports an erratic North Korean regime that sinks a South Korean naval vessel in recent months, calls for an Asia free of alliances, meaning U.S. alliances. Not, I would argue, to promote a common interest in stability in Asia, but to stamp its own influence on Asian stability and exert its control on its own borders and neighboring sea lanes. Now, both the jigsaw and the chessboard views of the world, as I say, make sense under certain circumstances. Knowing how and when to combine them, I think, is the mark of great leadership. George Bush, it's argued, pushed the chessboard view too far. The conventional criticism is that he overreacted to the threat posed by 9/11. treated it as a war against freedom-loving states, you are with us or against us, rather than as a crime against humanity, affecting both democratic and non-democratic societies. But seeing terrorism as a crime against humanity, rather than a war between democratic and despotic philosophies, privileges the jigsaw puzzle view of the world. From a chessboard view, Muslim extremists are attacking freedom and the political status quo. They're not just committing crimes, which are random and not necessarily challenging the political status quo. I think a more telling criticism of the Bush strategy is not that he overemphasized or deployed the chessboard view of the world, but that he failed to complement it at the right time in a timely manner with the jigsaw puzzle view. The time when he should have applied some of the jigsaw puzzle view was right after the successful invasions of both Afghanistan and Iraq, summer of 2003. That was the moment to use the leverage gained by military force to structure a multilateral approach to both the Middle East and South Asia that would have advanced the cause of both freedom and stability. Instead, Bush waited, as we know, until November of 2007 to launch a Middle East peace initiative, and he dithered with his reconstruction programs in Iraq for several years. At least his policies would have left a somewhat better legacy, a somewhat better impression, had he done so, in my view. Now, Obama's era may be just the opposite. He is overplaying the jigsaw view of the world, jigsaw puzzle view of the world, and leaving himself undefended if other major countries are playing chess, as I think they may be. He's painting the picture of the United States as a paper tiger. He does not identify with his defense budget, and I say that as one who worked for Ronald Reagan, who knew how important that identification with his defense budget was to Ronald Reagan's diplomacy. I can't think of any moment at which Obama has made clear that he's identified with his defense budget. He is reluctant to put forces on the ground to buttress allies and to deter adversaries. As I mentioned, he's pulling forces out of Iraq just at the moment when Iran's influence in the region is potentially increasing. Why doesn't he leave some doubt as to whether or not we will come out of Iraq as a counter to growing Iranian policy? He creates problems for allies, Israel on settlements, Poland and the Czech Republic on missile defenses, Japan on rebasing forces in Okinawa, while cozying up to adversaries, Russia on arms control, China on climate change, Iran on negotiations. He relies exclusively on multilateral economic sanctions to stop Iran's nuclear program. I thought it was curious that Secretary of Defense Gates had to explicitly deny the paper tiger charge in a recent press conference. It may suggest that the charge is beginning to stick. So without a greater willingness to integrate the use of force with his diplomacy, Obama's foreign policy, I fear, is flaccid. His engagement policy is simply without impact. While Obama and his supporters are celebrating some initial diplomatic breakthroughs, such as the START agreement, as was suggested this morning, by many accounts, the cause of freedom, meanwhile, is moving backwards in the streets of Iran, in the prisons of Russia and Egypt, and on the internet in China. Now, as I mentioned to conclude, the most successful American presidents have deftly combined a chessboard and a jigsaw puzzle view of the world. Polk, I think, was truly the all-time master of what I would call forceful diplomacy. That is, knowing not just when to engage, but knowing when to use force to create the circumstances under which you want to engage, and to integrate in some fundamental way these two instruments of foreign policy. If Bush went too far in the direction of force and not enough diplomacy, Obama's clearly going in the direction of too much engagement, too much diplomacy, and not calculating the need to back that diplomacy up with necessary force. Polk never launched a military operation without a simultaneously diplomatic envoy. He did it 4 times in his effort to conquer the New Mexico and California, that is, to conquer that portion, by the way, only that portion of Mexico that he was determined to obtain, initially by purchase, and if not by purchase, then by conquest. 4 times he ratcheted up the military instrument, and 4 times simultaneously he sent a diplomat to try to negotiate a solution. It was very fortunate he did so, because it was the presence of Nicholas Trist, one of those diplomats, in Mexico, in Mexico City, that allowed a resolution to be reached in early 1948 that was short of a full occupation of Mexico, which probably would have been disastrous for us at the time. So keeping these two instruments in fine tune with one another helped him to achieve his objectives and to do it in a way that was compatible with the resources of the country. Now, Reagan, as I mentioned, I think was a very worthy successor to Polk. We're learning more and more about Ronald Reagan. People don't study him as much as I wish they would because enormous amount of material has been released on him in recent years. But we now know that from the very beginning he intended to negotiate with the Soviet Union. But unlike, I think, perhaps one could argue, President Obama, he decided that the time for engagement was not 1981, when America was potentially weak, potentially perceived as being in retreat, that he needed some time to build up his leverage. And indeed, that's what he did. He spent his first term creating that leverage, which he then deployed very deftly and very successfully in diplomacy in his second term, essentially closing off to the Soviet Union any alternatives they may have thought they had for competing with the United States outside of the negotiating arena. And so inside the negotiating arena now, Gorbachev, with most of his other options cut off, made concessions and made deals that one has to conclude were far more on our side of the line, that is, favored our interests much more than the interests of the Soviet Union. Well, as you can tell from these remarks, I'm not convinced that the world has changed in some fundamental way. I think we still are playing with these two different ways, fundamentally these two different ways of thinking about the world, much of our discussion, it seems to me, from this morning into this afternoon can be played out in terms of this question of when is the right time to engage and to what extent to use force to create the circumstances for engagement rather than just simply reacting to circumstances through engagement.
Well, first of all, I want to thank the Naval War College for pulling together what is a fascinating 2 days of current strategy forum discussion with a wide range of views and interest, and to commend Rear Admiral Phil Weisskopf for his leadership in this, and also for giving me a chance to see your provost, who's an old friend, Mary Ann Peters. What I would like to do is give you a slightly different perspective than the two previous speakers. I'll go through the changes in the emerging international system and how it actually expands opportunities to keep America safe. What I'll do is identify and discuss 3 sets of networks and how I think the U.S. should be able to use them to promote our security and prosperity. The first is the grouping of nonproliferation and climate change. The second is poverty and the global financial institutions, and the third is terrorism and security. I would actually differ somewhat from Henry's presentation, and then I do think the world has changed. I think we need to take a much more holistic approach to our challenges, recognize that progress in one area does actually impact progress in another. That lack of progress in certain areas can damage progress in other areas. Today we face a myriad of challenges that threaten all of us. Terrorism, the impacts of climate change, the brutal shifts of globalization, abject poverty. Terrorism is #1 in that challenge, but a lot of these other ones feed into that. And none of these challenges can be resolved by one country alone, even a superpower. Each will require committed international partnerships and strong U.S. leadership. Henry wrote a book on myths. My first book was also about myths, but the myth that because we're the lone superpower does not mean that we cannot engage in the rest of the world, harness the rest of the power of the world to our interests. Unless we engage in the tools and the rules of the road, we are less secure than we need to be. In listening to Henry, I realize I look at the world less in terms of a chess or a checkerboard, and I hadn't thought of this symbol until he was talking about the chess and checkerboard. And I think you almost have to look at the world today as that three-dimensional chessboard in Star Trek. Do you remember that one that they used to play on all the different levels? You have to almost do all at the same time. And yes, it would be great to be able to go back to the Cold War. We only had to worry about containing the big powers and the balance of power between Russia, then the Soviet Union, and China. And today, of course, we have to worry about those. I would actually join the max boot reign that I will put my eggs in the American basket every second of my professional life. I think we're the best. We're going to be the best for a long time. And I'll take on India and China anytime with that. But it doesn't mean that we don't need to look at and engage them in a way that's different. If we treat China like an enemy, it will become an enemy. If we engage them, no, they're not going to help us on climate change right now. No, they're not doing much on North Korea. But we can't force them to do that unless we want to invade and occupy them, and no one's recommending that. So you need to work with them and harness the global energy to move that. What I'll do is go through some of these challenges and explain what I mean by each of that. First on the nonproliferation and the environment. In each of these, you have global rules of the road that can keep us safer and make us more prosperous. And the two are interlinked. What happens on our climate change, on our nonproliferation area is going to have an impact on our environment and vice versa. I would actually take a different view on Obama's nonproliferation policy. I actually think this is going to be one of his more impressive legacies. Whether he has one or two terms, what he's doing is actually rebuilding the international global nonproliferation architecture, which has actually kept us safe. When President Kennedy was president in 1960, the assumption was that there would be 25 nuclear powers in the world. Because of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty signed by 189 out of 192 countries today, there's only 9 countries that are, now that's too many, but 4 countries are the only ones that have joined the nuclear club since that treaty was signed, and we're safer because of that. What it means is that you need to look at what our intelligence says, and every intelligence report, President Bush said this regularly, that the gravest threat that we face today is that the next 9/11 will include weapons of mass destruction. Imagine 9/11 if those planes had chemical or biological, God forbid, nuclear weapons. It would have been tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands dead. And yet the reason that you've had two weapons of mass destruction attacked by terrorists in the history of recent history. One is the sarin gas attack in the Tokyo subway in the mid-90s, and the other is the anthrax attacks here in the United States. That's it, which is a pretty good record if you think about it. We know that Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda are looking for nuclear weapons. They put it openly out on their website. It is in our direct national security interest to make sure that we secure, lock down, and reduce the number and purposes of nuclear weapons in our efforts. And that's exactly what Obama has set out to do. The START treaty with the Russians is directly in our interest. Further reductions are likely to follow. In the nuclear posture review, President Obama has reduced the role and purpose of nuclear weapons. And that helps us negotiate with the rest of the world to secure lockdown and make sure that there are not more members of the nuclear club. For the first time in 5 years, we've actually constructively engaged in the Nuclear Nonproliferation Review Conference that has just concluded at the UN in May. And the result was a document that strengthened the world's commitment to nuclear disarmament, nonproliferation, and the promotion of peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Now, these are not Obama's ideas. These have been developed by thinkers across the world, and in the United States, actually led by one of the more conservative leaders in our national security arena, Henry Kissinger, who's looked at the world and said, you know, we are less safe with nuclear weapons in the world today than we are with them, because we are the ones with a target on our back if any terrorist is going to get a nuclear weapon. Yes, we need to keep a nuclear arsenal as a hedge to a potential resurgent China or Russia, but the more we can reduce the purpose and role of these things, the safer the United States will be. And I think it's important for our strategic analysts in our own government and those at the Naval War College to really think anew about how to look at these issues. There are two pieces of legislation that President Obama will address on this issue, and it's not clear that either is going to get through this Congress. One is the New START treaty, because probably will get through, but it's not a given because of the issues of testing and the new nuclear weapons debate. And the other is much less certain, is the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which President Clinton signed in '96 and has languished ever since. But the more we can do to contain these weapons, the safer we'll be. The more we can do to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in our arsenal, the more we will succeed in making sure that Iran does not acquire a nuclear weapon, and to begin to continue to contain North Korea's. Secondly, let me just touch briefly on global warming. I think nothing symbolizes the need to wean ourselves from our addiction to oil than the tragedy going on off our coast in Louisiana and the Gulf. And our continued need to engage militarily across the Middle East. I think we recognize the need to break from the old ways that threaten our economy, and President Obama has committed to investing $150 billion in clean energy and development over the years. But we are way behind where we need to be, both in trying to establish a green technology and in keeping the United States on the forefront of the search for a green and secure energy policy. The technology race is a real challenge. 15 years ago, the United States produced 40% of the world's solar panels, but by last year it had dropped to 5%. A few years ago, we had the capacity to make just less than 2% of the world's advanced vehicle batteries. Now we're up to 40% and projected over the next 5 years. And this matters if we're going to figure out a way to get off our addiction to fossil fuels. President Obama has gotten a commitment from the G20 last fall in Pittsburgh to end fossil fuel subsidies. It makes no sense for these government to be subsidizing fossil fuels while at the same time trying to get off us. We ought to put that money into a separate area. And we've also invested a lot of time in trying to secure a commitment on trying to how to assist the developing world in adapting to climate change. Also at that most recent meeting in Copenhagen, that was largely a failure, but the world did commit to $100 billion in assisting the developing world to assist in the climate change. About 20% of that would be from the United States. Now that money is nowhere near real. It's not clear where that money is going to come from, or what the commitment between the private and the public sector is. But don't underestimate the need to get off of our fossil fuel addiction. Right now, the prediction is that it's at least 2 generations before we will have any significant reduction in our commitment. The Copenhagen climate change last December largely ended in failure without targeted commitments. The international community is now engaged in a new round of efforts to seek legally binding commitments on emission standards, which would include China and India. You have to remember that when this was negotiated first in the 1990s, China and India were not the largest emitters. That has changed. China is now the largest emitter and has surpassed us in 2009. And there's no one who is arguing that China and India don't need to be in the next round. The next coming up meeting is in Mexico, in Cancun in November. I don't know anyone who is particularly not optimistic about it, but global thinkers, when you're looking at emerging patterns, need to recognize that this is directly in our national security council. As we shift off of fossil fuels, one option is to go into nuclear energy. That is a very green technology. It helps solve the global climate, but coming with many more nuclear power plants, you flip back to the non-proliferation debate. How are you going to secure the fissile materials within each of those new power plants across the world? Not to mention those that are already out there. So that links back to the non-proliferation area of trying to secure all of our fissile materials, which is another of Obama's priority. And when you're looking at the new networks, it's important to recognize that Star Wars, three-dimensional checkboard, progress on one of these has an impact on all of these, and vice versa when it fails to move forward. The second area is poverty and the global financial institutions. And I think it's important to recognize that poverty is a threat to the United States today. If you look at where the immigration is coming from, a lot of it is driven by poverty. And where do they go? They come to the United States. We have a broken immigration system. All of this is interrelated. The UN has set forward Millennium Goals to try and cut poverty in half by 2015. We're nowhere meeting it. We also have to recognize that the poverty breeds conflict. If you look at the studies of 164 violent conflicts of the last 2 days, they were concentrated in poor countries and took place within states, not between states. And these are the very same environments where terrorists can take hold, where there's lawlessness, criminal networks, terrorist networks, drugs, human traffickers can set up shop. If you look at what's happening in Sudan, Somalia, Chad, the worst areas of the conflict in the world today, that's where the terrorists are getting their next foothold. Now, if you look at how can the United States address all this, I would strongly endorse the role that the United States cannot be the world's policeman, but American leadership on these issues does matter. We don't have to do it all ourselves, but until the United States takes a position on these global issues and leads, the rest of the world is just a mush. You watch the Europeans trying to negotiate a position until the United States takes a position. It's just all kind of jello. And then when the United States takes a position, the rest of the world forms it. And the further in engagement that the United States takes, the firmer position that you end up getting. There is a UN proposal out there to try and have a certain percentage of our GDP established for every country to do it. It's less than 1% of our GDP. It's 0.7%. Only the Northern Europeans do it. This is a continual debate within the UN. The U.S. is at about 0.2%, and would not take a whole lot for us to get up to that 0.7%, less than 1%. And the leadership on trying to address some of these poverty issues would help reduce those poverties, the conflict, and that lawlessness zones across the international community. The other area which would help greatly in reducing poverty reduction is to revive the Doha trade round, the poverty reduction development round that was started in Doha in 2001, essentially to have a worldwide reduction of agricultural products, agricultural subsidies around the world. This would be the biggest poverty reduction step in human history, probably, not so much for the lower billion, but that middle 4 billion people in the world could help lift a great number of them out of poverty. Unfortunately, the politics of taking on the entrenched interest, cattle, sugar, agriculture in the middle of a global recession means that the Doha round is absolutely dead. My own prediction is that it will not be taken up until 2013, regardless of who has president. In the lack of any progress on the global trade rounds, there are areas that we could be looking at now which we're not really focusing on anywhere near enough, in my view. As the developing world grows, we need to be prepared to embrace it, to manage it, and make sure that our own policies are adjusting it. That means for the BRIC countries, as Max Boot mentioned, Brazil, India, Russia, and China, we can't fear their growing prosperity, but we need to engage it and help manage it in the right direction. I will always put my bet on the United States of America winning a fair game, and I'm sure that if we can make sure that the level playing field exists by engaging the global rules of the road, I'll put my money on America winning that battle anytime over the Chinese and the Indians and others. But to do that, we need to engage the global international architecture, the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, try and work to get some of these trade preferences down. And sort of take on and manage the entrance of these major developing countries. There's 300 million people in the United States. In the last 10 years, 300 million people in China have risen out of poverty. There's more middle-class people in China today than there are in the United States. Let's get in there, manage it, and beat them at their own game. One way of addressing these issues is to update the international financial architecture that better reflects the developing world and enhances the consideration of the growing strong economies, Brazil, India, South Africa, many of the G20 countries. The global economic crisis, which has been going on for 2 years, coupled with this rise of the BRIC countries, has really brought to surface major deficiencies in the international economic system. And what's part of Obama's challenge here is to engage the international system and try and update it to the 21st century. What he's done is elevate the role of the G20 in Pittsburgh last year, but it's not at all clear what that means. Does it mean the G8 goes away? Does it mean you have that middle round of the G13 that meet, or does it mean that the G20, the G13, and the G8 all meet sequentially? None of this has been worked out. What you need to do is have the U.S. take the leadership in looking at constructive engagement in the international financial institutions, alternative proposals for trade, such as export orientation, exported orientation production for the developing countries, new financing for developments, U.S. leadership on trying to have global accounting standards. I want to know what China is doing in Africa when it's buying up the resources. You can't go to Africa today without looking at one of the corrupt countries that has the huge marble palaces that China built, or the soccer stadium built by China. Well, what are they taking out of the country for that investment, and who's lining their pockets with that? And I want a global economic standards that has trade investment so that I'll know what China and India and the rest of the world are doing in some of these developing countries. That will not happen without U.S. leadership in trying to engage and manage. Let me touch briefly on the UN. Obama has actually, I think, successfully engaged the UN. Now, I worked at the UN for 4 years as one of the ambassadors there, and then in the nonprofit trying to engage it. The UN is a mess. It has many problems. And today, if we tried to create the UN, I don't think our Congress would agree to it. Our American people wouldn't get the rants that you'll hear on the TV and radio talk shows make it sound like they're the most feckless organization in the world. And you never hear about the good things the UN does. But if you look at the UN today, it has the second largest deployed military in the entire world. Over 120,000 troops in 16 operations around the country, addressing the very problems that threaten the United States. Does anybody know that in the United States? Do you ever hear about that on Rush Limbaugh? No. But it is true, and we need to engage the U.S., needs to engage the UN. And to their credit, actually, I've been running a conference every 6 months between the UN and the Pentagon, which started in the Bush administration, of how the U.S. can help the UN do a better job in peacekeeping, because the U.S. recognizes that if the UN is doing it, we don't have to do it. It's a lot cheaper if the UN does it. It's 12 cents on the dollar for every U.S. soldier, for every U.S. peacekeeper out there. It's a lot cheaper, and we don't have to do it. And we're a little busy today in Afghanistan and Iraq. And we need to re-engage the UN, not just in paying the arrears and joining the very feckless Human Rights Council, but in trying to update the architecture of the United Nations, too. The UN Security Council reflects the world as it was in 1960. There was a real effort in 2005 to expand it. There was agreement on Germany, Brazil, Japan, and Germany, Japan, India, and Brazil joining it. The agreement fell apart over the African country, which they couldn't decide between Egypt, Nigeria, and South Africa, and over the veto. They need to get back to that deal, expand it by 7, and have it at least become a little bit more legitimate. Lastly, let me just touch base on terrorism and security. We've heard a lot about that from the other speakers, so I'll just touch on it quite briefly. I don't quite know where Henry gets the idea that Obama doesn't ever want to use force. First of all, he's the one who took and endorsed George Bush's time frame to wind down our operation in Iraq. It was George Bush's time frame that I think Obama rightly took on, and I think Iraq is actually going to work out just fine. I think we will be able to keep to that timetable. There'll be bumps in the roads, but ultimately I think Iraq will be stable and less of a focus of our troop commitments there, although I think we'll be there in some form for the time to come, but nowhere near the levels that we have now. Iraq, however, is going to look good in terms of Afghanistan. I think Obama was right to increase the troops in Afghanistan. He hasn't put a deadline on the troops there. He suggested that we can reduce the surge in 18 months, but he's made it clear that we're going to be in Afghanistan for the foreseeable future. And I think that's the right strategy. We cannot just pull out of Afghanistan. However, it's not a military solution. We do need to continue to capture and kill the al-Qaeda elements that are there. But over time, if you look at Afghanistan, it's going to be a long-term development program. We have a 28% literacy in that country. You have a president who's corrupt, who's the mayor of Kabul. He doesn't control the whole country. 50% of the GDP comes from opium, the opium trade. What you really need to do is have a 2-generation development program in Afghanistan. The best summary I've heard of the definition of success was by a general that I heard speak a few years ago, that we will be wildly successful in Afghanistan if we can leapfrog the country from the 14th to the 17th century. And that strikes me as about right. which is not the definition of a Jeffersonian democracy, but it's, I think, about where we're at. It is clear that Obama is going to end up handing off Afghanistan, Iraq, and of course Pakistan, the flip side of Afghanistan, which is even more dangerous, to a successor. We're not going to be done in either country by then, but I think they'll both be in a better place. Let me end with just the last plea on trying to look at the world as a multidimensional and interrelated chessboard. We have to do a better job of managing the global revolution that is coming on. We can't fear it. We can't hate the immigrants who are coming in this country. We need to manage it better. We need to embrace the trading relationships. We can't, anytime this country has withdrawn and isolated, put up trade barriers, kicked out the immigrants, we've done poorly. Europe's even worse at it. Part of the reason that Europe is not particularly well integrated is they're not letting any immigrants in and their population's declining. Same with Russia. It means embracing not a clash of civilization as Sam Huntington has proposed, but recognizing that we all want the same thing. The global community wants what I've called a prosperity agenda, which is to do well among your peers. And if we embrace that and lead it through American leadership, we will all be safer and secure. And I hope that's good fodder for some debate. Thank you.
Okay, we have some time for questions. I would remind you to use the microphone, as I neglected to earlier. And also, if you have a specific panelist that you'd like to address the question, please indicate that. Sir, right here.
My name is Jerry York, and I want to address my question to Henry and to Max. I think the implication of some of your statements was that things have not changed significantly over the last several years, and that the United States can continue to act as in a unilateral way as a major superpower. And I guess my question to you is, given that earlier today it was indicated that in 2000 our total debt was $6 trillion, and in 2010 it's now $13 trillion. Do you think that signals any change in how the U.S. can wage its diplomatic and foreign policy?
Yeah, of course, I agree with Max that we face some serious internal problems in terms of resources and in terms of sustaining the kind of foreign policy that I think we have been engaged in and we can continue to be engaged in. We are, as Max suggests, the dominant power in the world. If we don't do some of these things, others will, or much less manageable sort of regional conflicts are going to emerge. So I'm concerned about when Nancy's rather optimistic that Obama's going to pull it off in Afghanistan over the long run. That's going to cost a lot of money. He's got huge debts now that he's added to. He inherited a substantial debt. He's added to it. Where is he going to cut? And as Max pointed out, they're starting to look at the defense budget to cut. Well, a great place to cut would be to get out of Afghanistan. Define your objectives down far enough that you can get out. I mean, maybe 16th century, 15th century, but just get out. So I worry about that. He's going to, we have limited time. I think the American people are not that patient for long wars, for long drip wars. This is something George Bush forgot. And you have to have a strategy that complements force. And there's where I think Bush fell down. But you also have to have a strategy that uses force. And I have to say, although generally people sort of on my side of the aisle have been pleased with Obama's policies in Afghanistan. He's determined to do something about the prospect of terrorists using that piece of territory again in the future to attack the United States. But he's done it by narrowing more and more the occasions on which he thinks it's appropriate to use force. And he has, I think, ignored opportunities to show some interest in the leverage that is provided by military power in his relationships with Russia, in his relationships with China. in his relationships with Iran. There's nothing wrong with holding your hand out to Iran. I agree with Charlie Kupchan, who said, give it a try, but give it a try when you're strong. Don't give it a try when you're weak. Don't give it a try when your gesture is going to be interpreted as weakness. And that's the danger, I think, that Obama faces. I think this paper tiger image is going to grow. In fact, I think it's probably already widespread among elites in various capitals around the world.
Can I just reply on to that? I think the basic question is not a multinational approach to diplomacy and to solving these global problems potentially less expensive to the United States than the United States going alone?
I don't think anybody actually says the United States should do things alone because we prefer doing things alone. That's a straw man argument. It's a caricature of where the Bush administration was, for example. And, you know, people like to say, for example, we were unilateral in Iraq, forgetting, oh, by the way, we had something like 30 nations. Now, admittedly, a few of them were nations like Micronesia, but some of them were somewhat more substantial, nations like Great Britain and Australia and others. I think at the end of the day, the question is not whether we are going to act in concert with others or alone. The question is, are we willing to act alone if necessary while seeking allies where we can? And that's a philosophy that I would certainly adhere to. But I think in Afghanistan, we have seen the dangers of trying to be too multilateral because, in fact, we turned Afghanistan over to NATO, and God bless NATO. It's a wonderful institution. I'm in favor of it, but it can't run a war. And we've seen that in the last few years, and essentially what's happened is the country has gone to hell in a handbasket under NATO leadership. Now, I'm not suggesting it's all NATO's fault, but clearly NATO is not capable of keeping the Taliban down, and essentially what President Bush recognized in his last year and what President Obama has recognized now is if we're going to save Afghanistan from reverting back to the kind of state it was in prior to 9/11, we have to assert American leadership again. And I think that is clearly a lesson that is applicable elsewhere. You asked the question about debt, and does this make it impossible for us to act? I don't believe it does right now. I think down the road it is certainly a potential danger to American leadership. But keep in mind, and this is the key point I want you to take away from this, the defense budget is not what is driving our public debt. The defense budget is not what is driving the deficit. The defense budget is less than 5% of GDP, less than 20% of the federal budget. And I think it is, I see a tendency in this administration, unfortunately, you know, I think helped along by Secretary Gates, whom I admire and I think has been a great Secretary of Defense, but I see him basically making the argument now, as he did at the Eisenhower Library and before the Navy League, that it's the job of the Defense Department to cut itself back in order to deal with the rising level of public debt and the deficit that we face, whereas in fact, even if you got rid of defense altogether, we would still face these problems of social welfare spending. That's the real issue that we have to confront. That's the real threat to our long-term standing as a great power, is are we going to be crippled by these social transfer payments? But I don't think that the Defense Department should preemptively commit suicide in order to try to deal with these irresponsible spending that we face. And I hate to use this analogy in an audience like this, but you know, you see on the domestic side spending like a drunken sailor.
Let's see, who do we have for another question? Gentleman in the far back.
There's a guy standing waving all the way over there, too.
Okay, I'll turn him next and over here next.
Hello? Oh, good. I'm Michael Fay. I'm a member of the foundation. I'm surprised not to have heard more about North Korea today. There was an incident a few weeks ago in which a South Korean naval vessel was sunk, apparently by a North Korean torpedo. I'd be interested in hearing from Max and Nancy, because I think your views overlap the least. What threat you see North Korea poses to us or to the world at large, and what our policy should be with respect to North Korea. Thank you.
Well, I was actually in South Korea a few weeks ago, and they're obviously dealing with a very severe crisis from this insane regime armed with nuclear weapons, which is located to its north. The striking thing to me is the extent to which South Korea still depends upon us to find that solution. And that goes back to the theme that I was trying to suggest about America being the indispensable nation, as Madeleine Albright, to give credit to the Clinton administration, once said. It's striking to me that under the treaty, under the agreement signed with the Bush administration, operational control, or OPCON, of South Korean forces in wartime is due to revert to South Korea in 2012, whereas currently in wartime, South Korea's armed forces would fall under a U.S. four-star, the head of the command in Korea. But most of the senior military and political figures we talk to in South Korea think that's a bad idea. They want to delay the reversion of OPCON for a number of years in the future. And that, to me, is just an amazing, mind-boggling vote of confidence in American leadership. What other country would turn over command of its armed forces, the very core of its sovereignty, to another nation? Is that a responsibility that South Korea would trust to Japan, to China? It's unthinkable. And yet they trust us because they essentially view us as acting in their interests. And I think that's the case. I think we have to keep a strong continuing presence in South Korea to provide that deterrence against North Korean aggression. Now, as we can see, even with the American presence and even with the large and capable South Korean armed forces, the North Koreans are capable of committing crazy, terrible acts of aggression like sinking the Cheonan. I think ultimately the answer there is we have to work towards the peaceful implosion of North Korea. We have to work towards the peaceful change of regime and the unification of the Korean Peninsula. And we often pay lip service to that, but there's a lot of hesitancy about actually pushing for it because South Koreans, for example, have been very wary of assuming the costs of unification. But I think what they've seen recently is that there are rather large costs to not unifying as well. And I think we need to put pressure on China to the extent that we can to try to decrease its level of support. But it's very hard because, you know, contrary to some of the things that we've heard here earlier, China does not see the world in the same way we do. They don't have the same outlook. They're afraid of a unified Korea. They're afraid of refugee problems. They're afraid of an American ally in the Yalu River. So they don't have the same interests that we have in safeguarding freedom on the Korean Peninsula.
There's actually probably less difference on this issue than some other ones. I would agree with the characterization that, you know, our hope is for a regime change in North Korea. It's the only way you're going to end this ongoing nuclear blackmail that North Korea has been engaged in, frankly, since the Soviets started giving them nuclear power machines in the late 70s, and it's continued on through the first Bush, through the Clinton administration, through the second Bush, and Obama's going to face the same thing. I remember sitting in the National Security Council at these principals and deputies committee meetings when the first crisis happened in '94, and you know, the military comes in and gives you all the scenarios of what's going to happen if you go to war, what the options are. And there are no pretty ones. And so this is a problem where ultimately there are no good options. So you look at, okay, what's the least bad option you have in North Korea? You can negotiate the way we are, which you know, whatever deal you make with North Korea, they'll break it. So you try and in each agreement have better verification, tougher measures. But that's the cycle we've been on now for almost 20 years with North Korea. And the reason we keep going into bad deals with North Korea and they keep cheating and we keep finding it and we renegotiate it is because China continues to prop them up. It is an unsustainable regime propped up by China for its interests that differ from us, yes, but from China's perspective, it does not want an implosion of North Koreans because they're all going to go to China. It is not a surprise to me that that South Korea looks to us because South Korea is more than well aware of the fact that they cannot deal with China or Russia in trying to solve this issue. So our policies are just pull out, let them do what they want, try and invade North Korea, which no one's recommending. Pushing China, I think we have been pushing China. They periodically help, they periodically don't help. Their calculations are just simple. So I look at North Korea as a very dangerous situation. It's gotten a lot more dangerous in the last 6 months. I think you're in a transition of power to a, 27-year-old that nobody knows anything about. That does not inspire confidence in me. But for some bizarre reason, I don't see a break in the cycle of the leadership there through this next transition of power. You never know. The rest of the world seems to have woken up that they don't have to live under these types of regimes. North Korea will eventually implode. The question is, how do you organize a soft landing? And no one has really figured this out yet. So I don't think you'll see a huge change one way or the other on this issue, but I think it is one of the more dangerous issues. I think the reason it didn't come up is because I don't think any of us have any brilliant ideas of how better to do it other than more of the same.
Okay. For Dr. Boot and the other panelists, and don't get me wrong, I respect the gentleman very much, but I'd be interested to hear the panelists discuss how the Secretary of Defense can justify acceptance of his title when he fails to champion an adequate defense budget. And I'd be interested to see a show of hands from my fellow attendees, how many favor a larger Navy rather than a shrinking Navy.
Actually, I will mention. Let me ask. I was going to mention this after Max was talking. Is, you know, I think what Secretary Gates is trying to do in terms of the defense budget is less just overall cut the budget as a way of fixing the deficit. I've actually never. Max probably reads his speeches more closely than I do, but I've not heard Gates talk about the need to cut the defense budget in terms of resolving the budget. As Max points out, it's nowhere near big enough to affect the budget. That's more on the tax policy and the social programs that we're debating in Washington. What Gates is trying to do is modernize the force to ensure that we don't have systems that were built for the Cold War and taking on some of the entrenched industry operatives in that area. And he's frankly trying to get out of a lot of the foreign policy role that ought to rightly be in the State Department. There's a big debate in Washington of how do you reshape the civil-military balance. Over the last 20 years, the Pentagon has taken on all the peacekeeping missions, all the training, all the police work that frankly should be in the State Department. State Department doesn't have the budget or the capability to do it right now, but all the reviews that are going on in Washington right now are addressing how do you shift a big chunk of that to it. Now, I have never heard Secretary Gates say, okay, we want to shift these responsibilities back to the State Department, and here's $100 billion to do it, which is about what it would cost. But there are big debates right now, and as well as on Congress, of what is the appropriate role for the Pentagon to be in the 21st challenges. And that's going to require some tough choices, but it's not driven by a desire to cut the budget so much as a desire to bring the military into the 21st century. I think the Navy has a key role in that. China is going to be a competitor of ours in the next few years. We're going to have to watch what China's doing. China's building a Navy. It's still puny in comparison to ours many times over. But increasingly, these are going to be a sort of a naval global challenge. And I think you need to look at what Secretary Gates is trying to do, which is to transform it to the threats that we face today. And doing so, it's very controversial. He's taking on the most entrenched values in the whole industrial complex, and I think he deserves support in trying to do what he's doing.
If I could just very quickly, I know we got to wrap up and go on to the next session, but that's not how I interpret what Secretary Gates is doing at all. And if you read the speech that he actually gave at the Eisenhower Library, he was very clear that defense budgets cannot continue to rise, that we are entering a period of austerity. We need to cut because the growth we've seen in defense spending over the last decade is not going to continue. And in fact, we're seeing from the Obama administration budget projections that they expect defense to come down as a percentage of GDP from almost 5% that it is today to closer to 3% in the next few years. So I do see it being driven by austerity and by this curious bifurcation within this current administration, where they've opened the spigots on domestic spending, but they're tightening the tap on the defense budget, and so all the services are having to find austerity measures. And believe me, obviously there is waste, fraud, and abuse in the Pentagon. Goodness knows, I'm sure all of you know that. But you're not going to be able to cut the Pentagon budget and double the fleet at the same time by getting rid of the line item for waste, fraud, and abuse. The real world doesn't work like that. Yeah, you can get a little bit more austerity, but you know, every Secretary of Defense, including the previous one, a fellow named Don Rumsfeld, come in saying, wow, this place is really inefficient. I'm going to cut the fraud. I'm going to cut the abuse. I'm going to cut the feather bedding. I'm going to get more for the buck, more bang for the buck. And yeah, you can do a little bit of that, but at the end of the day, the Pentagon is still one of the world's largest bureaucracies, and there's a limit to how much you can actually cut, especially when there are competing political demands on the budget and various other external factors. At the end of the day, more money buys more capability, less money buys less capability. I don't buy this notion that you can do more with less. I think the armed forces are already overstretched. And again, I think Secretary Gates overall has been a very good Secretary of Defense, but I think he's treading into dangerous waters if he thinks that he can safeguard America's global commitments on a substantially reduced defense budget. It just ain't so.
What? Just one very brief. Very brief addition to that. I mean, what worries me about the whole debate is that Secretary Gates is in the headlines. Where is Obama? Obama has outsourced his defense budget. From the very beginning, remember there was a moment last spring where Gates didn't go to a NATO meeting. Can you imagine? A Secretary of Defense did not go to a NATO meeting because he was responsible for shepherding the initial sort of defense budget through Congress. Obama went to bat to the tune of $1 trillion to support domestic health care. Where is he on the defense budget, which is the absolute bedrock underpinning of your foreign policy, as I've tried to suggest? I think he's outsourced it, and that worries me more than anything else, because the domestic pressures are going to eventually overwhelm Gates or anyone else without presidential leadership on this question. And admittedly, I agree with Max, by the way, that you can cut spending. I was in the Reagan administration when we did, the services loved us. I had a brother who was a career military officer at the time, and he used to send me little notes all the time saying, Henry, keep it coming, keep it coming. Our golf courses are looking great. We got the best mulched gardens you can imagine. So we can all cut back, but it's a much broader issue here having to do with priorities and who's in charge and what does the defense budget mean to Obama, and where does force play a role in his overall approach to foreign policy? That's my concern.
Well, I think this was a lively enough panel that I see almost no one nodding off out there. However, I want to thank our distinguished panelists for a lively discussion with various points of view presented, and turn it over to Captain Sherlock for now.
All right, great panel. Listen, a little behind, so I'd ask you to be back in your seats by 4:05.